Imagine standing before a king, a man who can order your execution with the flick of a finger, and your only shield is a joke, a jest, a chuckle you must pull from his royal lungs to survive another day. You are a medieval court jester, a performer, cloaked in motley colours and hidden meanings, who dances on the knife's edge between amusement and annihilation. From the outside, you're the bringer of levity, but beneath the cap and bells, you carry a burden few would envy, the obligation to laugh, to entertain, and to exist as both spectacle and shadow, in a court where laughter is currency and silence could cost your life. No one asks to become a jester. Some are born with deformities, others with peculiar wit, and some with misfortunes so profound that their only escape is to become a fool. It's a role thrust upon the vulnerable, the strange, or the unlucky, a cruel opportunity wrapped in silk and song. Many are taken as children, noticed for their oddity or quick tongue, plucked from the streets or orphanages, and handed over to the palace for grooming. The more unusual your appearance or mannerisms, the better. In a world obsessed with order, symmetry, and decorum, the jester was a sanctioned anomaly. You didn't belong, but that was precisely the point. At court, your lodging is no luxurious chamber. A small, drafty room near the guard quarters becomes your home. A stone box with barely enough space to lie flat. Your possessions are few. A worn-out trunk filled with costumes, a lute with frayed strings, a candle stub, and a sliver of mirror for applying your grotesque face paint. A rusted chamber pot in the corner reminds you of your station. Even the rats don't mind sharing your room. At dawn, you rise not to prayers or leisure, but to rehearsal. Practice your tumbles, fine-tune your satire, revise your mimicry. Because one wrong syllable, one raised brow during the punchline could mean the end. You must be quick-witted, yet submissive, intelligent, but not threatening, sharp, but never cutting. It's a performance that extends beyond the stage into every moment of your waking life, and it never ends. The garments of your trade are deliberately humiliating. The motley, a patchwork of mismatched colours, is stitched to make you ridiculous. Your hat, adorned with donkey ears or 3 curved horns, jingles as you move so that, no matter where you go, you cannot be ignored. It's a reminder, you are not one of them. Your shoes curl at the toe like question marks, and your painted face, always with exaggerated expressions, hides whatever truth might lie beneath. The costume is armor and branding all at once, a prison made of cloth and laughter. You are expected to mock, to sing, to provoke. You might impersonate a noble to their face, drawing a chorus of laughter from the watching lords and ladies. But you must know the boundaries. You must know when the laughter tips into discomfort, when a joke scratches too deep. Because if a noble's pride is pricked, you won't be granted a second chance. Whipping, exile, or death are all within reach of a single misjudged jest. History is littered with jesters who forgot their place, or who were simply too clever, for their own good. And yet, in this treacherous role lies an odd kind of power. You, alone among the courtiers, may speak truths others dare not utter. You might mock the king's policies in rhyme, poke fun at his generals in song, and expose the hypocrisy of the clergy through satire. You are both protected and exposed by your absurdity. The court laughs because they believe you harmless. They laugh because they think you beneath them. But you know better. Behind your mask is observation. Constant, piercing, strategic. You gather secrets from drunk nobles, overhear whispers between handmaids, and interpret silences better than anyone. Some jesters become informal advisors. A few become spies. All must become survivors. There are no days off. At a moment's notice you must perform, whether in a banquet hall echoing with music and mead, or in a private chamber where a brooding monarch demands to be amused. You learn to read rooms faster than diplomats, to adjust your humour for every audience. With the guards, you jest with physical comedy. With the queen, wordplay and riddles. With foreign envoys, a touch of humility and exaggerated clumsiness. Humour is your instrument. but diplomacy is your art. Still, even the best performances fade. The laughter dies. The king's mood shifts. A war begins. A famine hits. And suddenly, the court no longer finds fools funny. They want scapegoats, someone to hang, to banish, to blame. And you, ever visible, ever vulnerable, become the perfect target. When you lie awake at night, you think of who you were before the bells and motley. You wonder how many know your real name. You remember your mother's voice, or the cobbled streets of the city where you first learned to juggle. You replay the day you made the king laugh so hard he cried, and the day he scowled and looked away. You think of the other fools, the ones who didn't last. There was Garrick, the limping jester from Normandy, whose joke about taxes cost him a public lashing. Or Tilda, the sharp-tongued girl from Wales, who vanished after mocking a visiting baron's wait. No one talks about them now. No one dares. The court remembers only what it finds amusing. The rest fades into shadow. Yet even knowing all this, you rise again each morning. You paint your face. You tie your bells. You rehearse your lines. Not just because it is your duty, but because, in your own strange way, you believe in the power of laughter. You've seen it soften tyrants, bridge divides, and distract a kingdom on the brink of collapse. You've seen it save lives, perhaps even your own. And so you perform. You endure, not out of foolishness, but out of quiet defiance. Because beneath the painted grin, beneath the jingling bells, beneath the raucous laughter echoing through the great hall, you remain one of the few who still dares to speak truth to power, even if it must come wrapped in a joke. By the time the sun rises over the stone walls of the castle, the jester has already begun his second performance of the day. This time, not for the king or nobles, but for the soldiers changing shifts outside the barracks. It is a crude performance, full of exaggerated gestures and mock battle cries, but it draws laughter from the otherwise stoic guards. This is not just entertainment, it is insurance. Win their favor now, and they may look the other way when you sneak bread from the kitchens or loiter too long in the hallway. A wise jester knows that survival in court is not just about pleasing the monarch. It's about staying useful to everyone. Unlike knights who train in swordplay or clerics who study scripture, the jester's training is entirely improvised, honed in shadows and whispers, not in formal halls. There is no school, no master. Everything is learned through imitation and survival. When a new fool is brought to court, often a child or adolescent, they are left under the wing of an older, more experienced jester, if they're lucky. This mentor teaches them the fine art of navigating insult without offense, of mocking power without threat, of twisting satire into something the court will accept as innocent. They learn to balance precariously between humor and danger, how to entertain without crossing invisible lines drawn by fragile egos and political tensions. Their mornings are filled with physical practice, juggling, tumbling, handstands, and slapstick. While their appearance may suggest clumsiness, every fall is precise, every stumble calculated for maximum comedic effect. In the afternoons, they memorize tales, rewrite old jokes, and study the quirks of the court's ever-changing roster of guests. Who walks with a limp? Who speaks too loudly? Who flirts too obviously? These become material, transformed into harmless barbs during the evening feast. At night, they rehearse their delivery in whispers, facing the cracked mirror in their quarters, testing tone and timing until it becomes second nature. A good jester doesn't simply tell jokes. They craft them like spells, each word a carefully placed charm meant to amuse, disarm, or distract. The court is a place of endless theatre, and the jester is both actor and audience. Even when not performing, they are being watched. Nobles scrutinize them for signs of disrespect, while rivals look for any slip that might be used as leverage. The queen may smile at your cleverness today, but whisper to the steward tomorrow that you overstepped. It is a place where words echo longer than laughter. The walls themselves seem to listen. The jester learns to speak in double meanings, to coat truth in honeyed sarcasm, to make sure that even their sharpest jokes feel like kisses, never cuts. And in the process, they become fluent in a language only the court understands, a language of glances, gestures, and innuendo. Living quarters for a jester vary by kingdom, but rarely are they luxurious. In many courts, the jester sleeps in a small room adjacent to the servants' wing, a space not quite private, yet set apart. It smells of grease and dust. The ceiling low, the window narrow. Their bedding is straw-stuffed linen, and their meals consist of leftovers from the nobles' tables. Yet even this modest existence is better than the outside world. For here, the jester has a roof, food, and purpose. In the chaos of medieval life, those are not small things. Outside the palace walls, the world is unforgiving. Disease, famine, war. Inside, it is dangerous in different ways, but at least there is order. Over time, a jester develops a persona, an exaggerated version of themselves that becomes recognizable across the court. Some are silly and childlike, others sarcastic and biting. This persona becomes a mask they wear so convincingly, many forget there is a person beneath it. They might speak in rhymes, invent catchphrases, or adopt an unusual gait. These quirks become trademarks. Even the king might imitate them in jest, a dangerous flattery. For as amusing as they are, the jester's greatest asset is not their costume or voice. It is their ability to make others forget they are watching someone who is watching them back. Not every day is a festival, of course. Some days the jester's presence is barely acknowledged. The court is tense, the air heavy with rumour or mourning. On such days, the jester walks carefully, speaks softly, and often retreats to the corners of the hall, waiting. These are the days when silence is the best performance. And yet, even in silence, the jester performs. Through posture, through attentive observation, through restraint. These days are tests of endurance, reminders that being a fool requires wisdom as much as wit. They must know when to vanish into the background, when to become invisible without disappearing completely. One of the lesser-known duties of the court jester is managing the morale of not just the nobility, but the household at large. Servants, pages, stable boys, they all watch the jester closely. When the jester is cheerful, it suggests the king is pleased the court stable. When the jester is quiet, it signals tension. Their demeanour becomes an unofficial barometer of royal moods. This responsibility is unspoken, yet universally understood. Even visiting dignitaries may inquire, half-jokingly, "And how fares the fool today?" as though the answer might reveal more about the realm than any report or scroll. Jesters are sometimes sent to accompany emissaries or join military campaigns, not to fight, but to entertain troops and ease tensions. Their role as comic relief becomes diplomacy by another name. It is not uncommon for a jester to return from war, knowing more about alliances and betrayals than the generals themselves. No one suspects the fool of listening, and that is their greatest weapon. Despite their visibility, jesters often feel invisible. They stand in the center of grand halls, but are rarely invited to speak outside of their role. They may witness love, betrayal, and strategy unfold before them, yet be barred from reacting. Their life is one of profound contradiction, to be ever present, yet never central, to be heard, but not truly listened to. And so, they channel all they see and feel into performance. Their laughter becomes layered with meaning. Their satire becomes a diary written aloud. In rare moments of solitude, perhaps at twilight before the evening feast, a jester might look at their reflection, half face painted, half face bare, and wonder which side is real. They may question whether the court sees them as human, or merely an instrument of amusement. But these thoughts are fleeting. There is always another jest to craft, another crowd to win over. Doubt is a luxury they cannot afford. Not when survival depends on being the first to laugh and the last to offend. The true power of the jester did not lie in his acrobatics or his foolish costume, but in something far more subtle, his tongue. Beneath the mask of absurdity, The jester carried a blade sharper than any knight's sword, a wit honed not only to amuse, but to expose, to reflect, to question. Satire was his most dangerous instrument, a form of power that slipped past guards and crossed thresholds that even noble titles could not. It was no secret that kings sometimes listened more closely to a well-crafted joke than to the gravest advice of their counsel. The jester could make an entire hall laugh and think at the same time, masking serious criticism in the softness of humour. While others bent the truth to survive, the jester bent it to reveal a sharper truth, one hidden behind the glittering laughter. In a court teeming with sycophants, where truth was often twisted to suit the king's pleasure, the jester's ability to speak plainly was paradoxically born from his role as the fool. While everyone else bowed and flattered, the jester could raise an eyebrow and deliver a biting remark that made the entire hall gasp or burst into laughter. He was permitted to say what others only dared to think, precisely because no one took him seriously. But therein lay the magic. His power was veiled in jest. A clever jester could shift opinions, steer conversations, and plant seeds of doubt in a sovereign's mind, without ever appearing to do so. He was the court's conscience in disguise, and like all true mirrors, he reflected not only what pleased, but what shamed. Of course, this privilege was a double-edged sword. The same joke that amused one monarch could cost the jester his life under another. Historical scrolls whisper of jesters executed for a word too sharp, a verse too pointed. One tale speaks of a jester who, during a time of famine, mocked the king's gluttony with a song about a pig who dined alone. The court laughed, but the king did not. The next day, the jester vanished, his motley folded neatly at the foot of the throne. Another account tells of a queen who once honoured her fool with a golden bell for his boldness in mocking the clergy, only to have him strangled weeks later after he implied she ruled through vanity, not virtue. The line was thin and always shifting. A jester lived in a kingdom of moods. Satire, when wielded skillfully, held the power to influence policy, nudge rulers toward reflection, even prevent violence. One chronicler recounted a jester who diffused a tense standoff between two feuding lords by weaving their grievances into a play performed before the king. Through exaggerated caricatures, the jester revealed the absurdity of their quarrel, and the king, in laughter, brokered peace between them. It was not the ministers or clerics who brought resolution that day, but the fool with painted cheeks and a rhyming tongue. His art had turned tension into theatre, and pride into parody, and in doing so, he had done what no army could. He had preserved peace with a joke. In many ways, the jester was a mirror held up to power, not a passive reflection, but a distorted one that forced its subject to see their own grotesqueries magnified. While others dressed in silks and smiled through clenched teeth, the jester appeared in patched rags and spoke in riddles, yet he wielded influence through subversion. The fool's truth was masked in parody, his commentary cloaked in absurdity. To laugh at the fool was to laugh at oneself, if one had the courage to admit it. And in that laughter, uncomfortable truths were sometimes born. Some jesters understood this influence deeply and wielded it with the precision of seasoned courtiers. They memorized not only jokes, but histories, genealogies, and political tensions. They watched, listened, and anticipated. A jester could drop a line about taxation that would ripple through the ranks of advisors. He could mock a bishop's hypocrisy in a way that stung just enough to spark conversation, but not enough to draw blood. The best jesters did not simply entertain. They guided, they steered, and sometimes they warned. In some courts, the fool was more feared than the commander of the royal guard. Their performances became political commentary, wrapped in farce, a play within a play. They crafted verses that poked at unpopular decrees, pantomimes that mimicked the mannerisms of corrupt officials, and songs that hinted at scandal with just enough vagueness to remain safe. And yet, danger was ever present. A single frown from the wrong noble could turn a jest into an offense. The The jester had to navigate court like a ship through reefs, charting a course between candor and catastrophe. Every gesture, every inflection, had to be measured. Improvisation was never truly improvised. It was calculation disguised as whimsy. Even outside formal court hours, the jester remained a figure of influence. He might be called upon during private feasts, asked to perform for visiting dignitaries, or even summoned to the royal chamber to lift the king's spirits after a defeat. In these intimate settings, the lines between jest and counsel often blurred. A clever fool knew how to seed advice within humour, to dress guidance in irony. He might joke about the futility of a siege, just as the king considered war, or make light of a marriage alliance with barbed undertones about its risks. The best jesters were part advisor, part distraction, and entirely irreplaceable. But this influence, for all its nuance, came with isolation. The jester could not confide in others as easily as ministers or soldiers could. Any alliance he formed was suspect, any friendship viewed with caution. He stood apart, trusted by no one, yet needed by all. His words were repeated in whispers through the corridors, dissected by nobles who wondered what he really meant. Rumours clung to him like his bells, and interpretations of his jests were as varied as the ears that heard them. And when a joke touched too near the truth, suspicion turned to fear. The fool who revealed too much became a threat, and the court has no tolerance for threats, no matter how amusing. Some fools use this to their advantage, cultivating mystique. They allowed ambiguity to do the heavy lifting, letting the court project meaning onto their acts. The more uncertain the message, the more it stirred imagination. And when the jester remained silent, it often spoke louder than any joke. A bowed head during a contentious decree, a raised eyebrow during a toast. These gestures became part of his lexicon. He became not just an entertainer, but a symbol. In times of upheaval, the jester's attitude was read like prophecy. So what, then, was the jester? A fool, a truth-teller, a puppet, a spy? The answer, perhaps, was yes to all. He was a contradiction, made flesh, a creature both inside and outside the hierarchy, mocked and respected in the same breath. His value was measured not only in laughs, but in the space he carved for dissent. In courts built on appearances and manipulation, the jester's performance was the most honest deception. And though he wore bells and painted smiles, he knew more of the human heart than most priests or poets. His art was not merely comedy, it was survival. And in that delicate, perilous art, the jester became something greater than entertainment. He became necessary. From the moment the jester awoke, the castle buzzed with distant clatters of servants and the faint scent of bread drifting up from the kitchens below. He stretched beneath a thin blanket, bones creaking like the old wood, beneath him, and listened. It was still early. Light barely sliced through the slatted shutters, but his performance had already begun. In this world, simply existing in the court was an act. There were eyes everywhere, even before dawn. He rolled from his bed, the cold stone beneath his feet sobering, and padded across the small room that he called his own. There was no luxury here, just a narrow bed, a chipped basin, and the shelf where his motley hung like a sleeping bird, colourful and waiting. His fingers brushed over the fabric, patchworked from years of wear, each stitch a reminder of jesters, past and jests remembered. He dressed swiftly, no assistance needed, for the fool had no valet. He was expected to be ready before the court stirred, before breakfast bells, before even the steward yawned awake. His morning ritual was one of silent preparation, pulling on mismatched socks, dabbing grease paint onto his cheeks, loosening his limbs with stretches learned from acrobats and thieves. The transformation into the fool was not magical, but methodical. While the nobility took their time dressing with attendants' help, the jester dressed himself in silence. His motley, patched and threadbare in some places, still carried the vibrancy expected of his role. Its colours weren't just decoration, they were armour. Stripes of red, blue, green, and yellow announced him from a distance. It was impossible to be invisible when dressed like a rainbow. He dabbed grease paint on one cheek, then the other, not too much, just enough to look foolish, but not grotesque. Then came the bells, small ones at his collar, his wrists, his shoes. They jingled, faintly with every movement. These were not just ornaments, but warnings. The fool approaches. Be ready to laugh or to listen. The first performance of the day was never scheduled, yet it happened daily. Passing noblewomen expected a bow with a twist of wit. Stable boys lingered near stairwells in hopes he might mock their walk or pretend to tumble into a barrel. Even the old steward, perpetually sour, might raise a brow if the jester mimed his own shuffle. These were the warm-ups, small and constant. Every step he took could be observed, any gesture interpreted. Humour was currency, but also camouflage. He navigated the palace with a smile on his lips and mischief in his eyes, always ready to entertain, to distract, or to vanish, as the moment required. He belonged everywhere and nowhere. At midday, as nobles gathered in the great hall, the jester stood behind the throne, not beside it. His proximity to power did not equate to privilege. He was close, so he could be watched. Today's feast was for a visiting duke from a neighbouring kingdom, and the air was thick with tension disguised as pleasantries. The jester watched closely, noting which courtiers laughed too hard, who ignored whom, who drank more than usual. Every detail became potential material. When summoned, he stepped forward with practiced grace, launched into a tale of mistaken identity involving a goat, a bishop's hat, and a barrel of ale, and ended with a somersault that knocked over a goblet, intentionally. Laughter followed, and with it, relief. He bowed low, catching the eye of the duke, who smirked just enough. A successful start, a flick of the wrist, a slip of the tongue, and laughter burst across the table. The duke, caught off guard, chuckled at a jest about his own famously large hunting dogs being outwitted by squirrels. It was harmless enough, but the jester had made his point. Mock strength, offer humility. He spun it into a rhyme, added a jig, and bowed low. The king grinned. The queen rolled her eyes. The steward did not laugh. That meant the joke had landed somewhere useful. The jester's job wasn't simply to entertain, but to observe, to adjust the mood, to shift the balance. With a feather's touch, he knew when to be bold and when to retreat. As the feast carried on, the jester slipped away, not to rest, but to wander the less visible corridors of the palace. Here, the real stories lived, in kitchens, stables, servant quarters. He paused to help a scullery maid pick up spilled potatoes, offering a joke about royal feasts relying entirely on her slippery hands. She laughed, grateful. He learned the head chef had argued with the steward. In another hallway, a page boy whispered of a broken heirloom vase blamed on a favoured guest. All of this, gossip, tension, frustration, became part of the fool's understanding. The castle was not ruled by decrees alone, but by murmurs. Afternoon brought another request, this time from the royal children. In a sunlit room filled with cushions and scattered toys, the jester became a clown, a beast, a knight, a dragon. He balanced apples on his head while narrating the adventures of Sir Slippery Toes. The children shrieked with delight. The nursemaid chuckled. A watching lady-in-waiting offered a knowing smile. These small performances were no less important than courtly ones. To entertain the royal children was to remain useful. It made the fool part of the family, if only in fragments. As evening approached, he retreated briefly to his chamber, barely, larger than a closet, to revise his plans for the banquet performance. Tonight, a minor noble's daughter would be formally introduced to the court. The jester would need to tread carefully. Light jokes to ease her nerves, but nothing that risked embarrassment. He crafted lines in his head, tested rhymes aloud, struck one verse, replaced another. There was no script, only instinct. At sunset, as torches lit the corridors, he descended into the feast, like a figure of festivity, his bells announcing joy, his smile masking calculation. The banquet hall glowed with warmth, flickering candlelight, casting shadows against stone walls draped in tapestries. Musicians played a gentle tune as the nobility dined on venison, roasted pears, and spiced wine. The jester made his entrance with flair, performing a series of flips before tumbling into a deliberate heap. The hall laughed. He rose with exaggerated grace and launched into a tale of two fools seeking treasure in their own pockets. The story echoed the court's own follies, nobles questing for glory when comfort already surrounded them. The laughter that followed was tinged with knowing. Each jest was measured. He poked fun at the aging knight who still insisted on wearing armor at meals, at the bishop's fondness for dessert wine, at the young lord's overuse of hair oil, always with a smile, always with escape routes built into the joke. Laughter rippled like waves, some genuine, some forced. The jester watched the ripples, reading reactions like a poet reads pauses. He noted who clapped first, who frowned, who leaned toward their neighbor with a whisper. Comedy, for him, was as much observation as expression. Late into the night, after the laughter faded and the nobles dispersed, the jester remained. He gathered his props in silence, bowing once to the empty throne. Alone, the hall felt cavernous. He lingered at its center, letting the quiet settle. For a moment, he allowed his smile to drop. Then, slowly, he turned, exiting into the darkness beyond. Tomorrow would begin again, and with it, a new performance. The motley was more than fabric. To those who saw only bright colors and bells, it may have seemed like a costume stitched for amusement. But to the jester who wore it, the motley was both shield and script. Each patch told a story, each bell a subtle reminder that he could never walk silently, never hide in plain sight. The world expected a fool to be loud, colorful, and absurd, and the motley delivered that promise. Yet beneath its stitched squares lay centuries of meaning. Red, for passion or blood. Blue, for sorrow or loyalty. Green, for envy or rebirth. Yellow, for madness or gold. The jester knew every shade, every corner of his patchwork robe, not as random choice, but as a silent language, passed down through generations of fools. It was both absurd and sacred. Unlike the polished uniforms of guards or the flowing gowns of ladies, the motley was intentionally disordered. It was a visual rebellion against the symmetry and decorum of courtly life. Where others wore lineage, he wore contradiction. Where a knight might don a sigil to declare loyalty, the jester's costume declared no allegiance but to the truth, however painful. His very presence disrupted the aesthetic order of the hall, and in doing so, reminded everyone that no system was without flaw, no hierarchy without hypocrisy. The motley announced him before he spoke, and spoke even when he remained silent. The bells were not mere ornamentation. They rang with every step, a chorus of gentle chimes that forced attention and denied subtlety. There was no sneaking, no pretending to vanish. The jester's life was one of constant exposure. Yet, ironically, it was within this constant visibility that he found a kind of invisibility. So familiar were the colors, so expected the jingle, that courtiers forgot to listen closely. They laughed without hearing, saw without noticing. The jester, wrapped in chaos, became the observer of order. In his exaggeration, he captured truth. Grease paint was the final layer, applied in dim mirrors. It was part ritual, part disguise. The red nose, the exaggerated eyebrows, the smudged lines that drew laughter or pity, all tools of transformation. But it was not a mask in the traditional sense. It did not conceal, but revealed. The painted face gave permission to break boundaries. A solemn truth spoken from a painted mouth felt softer, easier to digest. The jester could weep beneath his smile, and none would question the contradiction. In pain, he played. In joy, he jested. The grease paint was a contract between performer and audience, between vulnerability and protection. Historians have long debated the origins of the motley. Some say it began with the tumblers of ancient Egypt. Others point to the comedic actors of Greece, who wore masks and mismatched robes. In medieval Europe, the motley evolved into its most recognizable form: loud, mismatched, and unmistakably foolish. Yet even then, variations abounded. In England, the diamond-patterned motley flourished. In France, stripes were favoured. And in Italy, the harlequin emerged, dancing with grace in his tight-fitting patchwork. Each culture dressed their fools in chaos, yet each hoped, secretly, for wisdom in return. The hat, often three-pointed and adorned with bells, was the crown of the fool. Modelled after donkey ears or coxcombs, it was a deliberate mockery of nobility's headwear. Where a king's crown signalled power, the jester's cap mocked it. Yet in that mockery lay wisdom. The hat said, "I know I am a fool, and that makes me dangerous." In an age when arrogance dressed in velvet, self-awareness was the jester's sharpest weapon. To wear the fool's cap willingly was to accept the role of outsider, to embrace ridicule, and in doing so, to wield it as truth. Children sometimes mimicked the jester, tying rags together to make their own motley, but it was always play to them. They could shed it at dusk. The real jester could not. He carried it even in his sleep, even when stripped of fabric. The identity clung like perfume or a scar. In market squares, travellers might point and whisper, "There goes the king's fool." No matter how quiet his step, the motley walked ahead of him. It was both banner and burden. Some jesters altered their motley deliberately, adding symbols stitched in corners, secret patches only they understood, a black thread for mourning, a silver cross for a joke gone too far, a green square for a royal favour. The motley became a diary worn in plain sight. No one noticed, or if they did, no one asked. Courtiers avoided looking too closely at the jesters. Clothes, afraid of what they might see reflected. But perhaps the greatest irony was that for all its absurdity, the motley was honest. It did not pretend to be elegant or refined. It embraced its own chaos, just as the jester embraced his. It spoke of contradictions, joy laced with sorrow, truth hidden in jest, wisdom masquerading as folly. It made no promises except to reflect the world as it was, not as it wished to be. And in that reflection, the motley carried more dignity than a robe of state or a knight's polished armour. There were times when the motley became a shield against despair. After a failed performance or a tense moment in court, the jester might retreat to his chamber and fold the motley across his lap. He would trace the seams, fingers running over familiar patterns, grounding himself in the fabric's memory. In that cloth lived his history. The first night he made the queen laugh. The morning he narrowly avoided punishment for mocking the bishop. The time he comforted a crying prince with a puppet dance. Every stain, every stitch was a testament to survival. On feast days, the motley was scrubbed and brightened, bells polished until they gleamed like coins. But even then, there were rules. Never wear the motley outside the castle walls without permission. Never let the laundry maid mend it. Only the jester touched its seams. Never mock a funeral while in motley. These rules were unwritten, passed down from fool to fool, forming a sacred code. To break them was to invite misfortune, or worse, to disrespect the role that history had forged. There were, of course, moments of envy. Watching lords parade in silks, ladies in embroidered gowns. The jester sometimes imagined wearing such finery, but he knew the illusion would crumble. Those garments offered status, his offered truth. While nobles wore masks of refinement, the jester wore a mirror. His costume exposed rather than disguised. He reminded the court of its vanity, its fears, its contradictions, and while it made him a figure of ridicule, it also made him indispensable. One evening, during a storm that shook the castle windows, the jester stood alone in the hall, the torches flickered, and his reflection danced in the marble floor. He removed his hat, held it to his chest, and whispered a line from an old rhyme. "The fool who knows he's foolish is wiser than the king who thinks he's just." Then, with a quiet breath, he placed the hat back on his head. Outside, the wind howled, but within the motley, there was calm. The storm would pass, as all storms did, and the fool would remain. In secret moments, the jester sometimes sketched future, motley designs onto parchment scraps, new patterns that no one else would ever see. Some bore swirling spirals that echoed the madness of politics. Others used fragmented shapes to represent the fractured truth behind polished speeches. He dreamed of a motley sewn from faded flags, each one representing a kingdom that had fallen to pride. He imagined bells forged from coins, jingling with the weight of spent fortunes. These were fantasies, of course, but fantasies rooted in truth. He thought, too, of what would happen when his time ended. Who would wear the motley next? Would they understand its weight? Would they treat it as merely costume? Or would they feel the years hidden in its seams? The jester hoped the next fool would respect it, not out of tradition, but out of empathy. The motley, after all, demanded sacrifice. It could never belong to someone who wanted to be admired. It belonged only to those willing to be misunderstood. Once a foreign visitor asked the jester if he ever tired of the colours. The jester replied with a smile, "Only when no one sees the grey beneath them." The man laughed, thinking it a joke. But the jester had meant it. For every flash of red or flicker of gold, there was sorrow hidden behind the spectacle. The motley did not hide the man. It revealed his layers, and only the wisest ever noticed. There is a quiet rhythm to the palace when the revelry ends, when the torches have burned low and the music fades into memory. In that hush, when even the stone seems to sleep, the jester walks the empty halls. This is not performance. This is reflection. After a day spent juggling laughter and danger, he returns to solitude, carrying the echoes of every joke and the weight of every silence. It is in these moments, away from the crowd, that the jester becomes most himself. No grease paint, no bells, no mask, just a man, alone with his thoughts and the soft creak of ancient floorboards beneath his feet. He often paces the long gallery, its moonlit windows casting silver across the floor. The tapestries whisper their own ancient stories as he passes. Here, he does not speak. He listens to the creak of floorboards, the rustle of his motley, the distant sigh of wind. These sounds soothe him more than applause ever could. He thinks of the day's performances, replaying them like an old script. Where did they laugh? Where did they wince? What did they pretend not to hear? Each pause in their laughter is a line he traces back to its root. Was it timing, tone, or truth too sharp to be disguised? There are memories that visit him in the quiet. Some bring warmth, a young princess clutching her sides in delight, a king's rare tear after a tale too close to truth. Others sting, a noble's narrowed eyes, a silence that lingered too long. But even these are companions. They remind him that he matters, that his words reach further than he knows. The court forgets sometimes that the fool remembers everything. It is part of his armor. Each performance adds to his archive, each jest etched into the vault of his mind. He keeps a small trunk beneath his bed, not filled with riches, but with remnants of stories past. Inside are carved puppets, each representing a facet of his craft: the fool, the king, the widow, the thief. There are ribbons from festivals, scraps of scripts never performed, broken bells that once sang with his every step. These objects, worn and silent, hold meaning only to him. They are not trophies, but memories made tangible. When sleep escapes him, he lifts the lid and sorts through the past, as if piecing together a puzzle only he can solve. Sometimes he writes, lines in the dust upon the window pane, riddles that only the moonlight sees. Other times he murmurs lullabies not meant for anyone but himself. His voice, soft and worn, carries melodies older than the tapestries. These are not performances. These are offerings given freely to the silence, as if to thank it for its patience. It is in this quiet that the jester reflects on why he began. He had not set out to be a fool. Once, long ago, he He had dreamed of being a scholar or perhaps a poet. But fate, with its crooked smile, nudged him toward the motley. It offered a path where wit was currency and truth could be hidden in laughter. He accepted, thinking it a detour. It became his life. Now, he could not imagine a world where he did not listen for applause or craft words like weapons wrapped in whimsy. And yet, he knows he is aging. His steps are not as quick, his voice not as bright. The court does not see it, not yet, but he does. In the mirror, when the grease paint is washed away, he sees the years. He wonders how many more seasons he can perform before the smile becomes too heavy. Will the court allow him to rest, or will he be replaced in silence, forgotten like a discarded rhyme? He considers legacy, not in monuments or verses, but in memory. Will they remember the fool who made them laugh, or the one who made them think? Will his stories linger in whispered retellings, passed from servant to scribe, or will they vanish like candle smoke in the morning? The jester has no children, no heirs. His lineage is performance. His inheritance is silence. Yet perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the echo of laughter in a quiet hall is all the immortality a fool can ask for. One night, as snow fell soft upon the palace eaves, he sat beside a dwindling fire and remembered his first jest. He had been terrified. His hands shook. The hall had felt enormous, filled with eyes that saw too much. He told a story of a goose who wanted to be a swan, only to discover that swans had enemies geese could never imagine. The nobles laughed. But the jester had noticed something else. A single nod from the queen, subtle and sincere. She had seen the meaning beneath the feathers. That moment never left him. It was the first time he realized that his words could plant seeds of thought in even the most carefully cultivated minds. Now, when he performs, he seeks not laughter first, but understanding. A pause, a breath, a glance. These are his applause. He listens for them in the hush that follows a well-placed line, in the way a lord fingers his goblet a moment too long, in how a servant hides a smile. These are the signs that he has stirred something true. Not every joke needs to roar. Some only need to whisper. When the jester finally drifts to sleep, it is not with dreams of grandeur. He dreams of stories unfinished, of verses not yet told. He dreams of a court where laughter and truth can sit side by side, where fools are valued not for how loud they can be, but how deeply they see. And as his eyes close, the motley rests beside him, a silent companion. It does not jingle, it does not gleam, but it holds within its fabric every line, every laugh, every tear, a patchwork of memory stitched into quiet legacy. He recalls the faces of those who once laughed but are now gone, courtiers sent to distant provinces, nobles who fell from favor, even a chambermaid who once wept at a tale he told, and then vanished the next season. Their names fade, but their reactions remain sharp in his memory. The jester carries them like notes in a melody. He believes that every performance leaves a trace, invisible but real, stitched into the walls, woven into the rugs, caught between the breath of laughter and the silence that follows. Sometimes he imagines what it would be like to leave, to walk away from the court, from the titles and torches, and become just a man again. He envisions a cottage in a quiet valley where he could tell stories to children and laugh without fear, where every word did not carry weight and every gesture was not a performance. But even in those dreams, he always returns to the motley. It waits for him like a faithful friend. He knows now that it is not the court that has trapped him. It is the calling. The jester is not a role he plays. It is who he has become. He has become the story he tells, a tale of survival hidden in humor, of vision disguised as nonsense. Others see the fool and forget to look further, but those who do, those rare few who truly listen, they find the thread of truth that runs beneath. It is not always golden. Sometimes it is dark, like the space between stars. But it connects everything, And the jester, in his quiet way, holds that thread with care. Tonight, before sleep, he steps into the hallway once more. The moonlight spills across the floor in silver ribbons, and he walks them like a path. No audience waits, no laughter follows, but still he performs, just for the silence, for the stone, for himself. A bow, a gesture, a whispered line from an old verse. And in that moment, the palace breathes with him, and the story continues. As he returns to his chamber, he catches a glimpse of his reflection in a narrow window pane. The man looking back is neither noble nor common, neither feared nor celebrated. He is something in between, a keeper of moments, a witness to history's private face. He raises a hand in quiet salute, not to vanity, but to continuity. For tomorrow and the day after, and the day after that, he will rise again, don the motley, and walk the fine line between illusion and insight. And in doing so, he will remind the world that even the quietest truths deserve to be heard. Perhaps that is the fool's greatest power. Not laughter, not satire, but remembrance. He remembers what others forget. He sees what others ignore. And in his stories, veiled in jest and wrapped in colour, he ensures that nothing, no cruelty, no kindness, no hidden truth, ever truly disappears. There was a village far from the court, where the mountains met the mist, and the rivers sang low songs through the valleys. Few nobles knew of it, even fewer cared. But the jester remembered it well. It was the place of his birth. He had not spoken of it in years, not even to himself. Yet sometimes, on nights when sleep refused him, and the fire whispered secrets, he would close his eyes and recall the crooked path that led from the mill to the well, the crooked fence that always leaned but never fell. He could hear the crows in the morning, the laughter of children chasing geese, the groan of the cart that never quite lost its limp. He remembered his mother's hands, calloused but gentle, as they scrubbed the day's work from his cheeks. She used to sing as she worked, melodies with no name, only feeling. His father, quiet and strong, built things that lasted, doors that closed without groaning, stools that never wobbled. They had little, but they made laughter from scraps. And in that laughter, the boy who would become a jester learned something vital, that joy need not be grand to be real. He had been a mimic even then, imitating the village elder's wheeze, the priest's solemn voice, the merchant's grand flourishes. His performances earned crusts of bread and pats on the head. But once, when he poked fun at the baron's tax collector, his father cuffed him gently and whispered, "Some laughter is not worth the price." That moment never left him. It was his first lesson in the politics of jest. The decision to leave the village had not come easily. There was no grand calling, no prophecy, no noble quest, just a restlessness in his bones and a whisper in the wind that said, "More." So he had walked away, taking only a bag of stories and a name he no longer uses. The world beyond the village had not welcomed him with open arms. It had tested him, shaped him, sharpened him, but it had never broken him. In the first town he reached, he performed in the square with nothing but his voice and a crooked stick he called a scepter. People threw coins, but also cabbage. He learned quickly that not every crowd was kind, and not every laugh was warm. Still, he pressed on. In one village, he shared a room with 5 other travelers, sleeping beside a man who muttered war memories in his sleep. In another, he was chased out for offending a merchant's wife with a joke about pickled fish. Each misstep taught him to observe more, to listen deeper, to speak with precision, dressed in whimsy. He found teachers in strange places, a blind harpist who showed him the rhythm of storytelling, a one-legged soldier who taught him the weight of silence, a puppeteer who gave him his first painted mask. From each, he gathered threads, weaving them into his growing craft. By the time he reached the capital, he was no longer a boy with a clever tongue. He was something else, not quite a performer, not yet a jester, but a man who had learned to speak many languages without changing his voice. His first audience with nobility was an accident. He had been performing outside an inn when a visiting courtier took notice. Amused, the courtier invited him to perform at a gathering. The hall had shimmered with candlelight, and every face seemed carved from stone. He had told the story of a dog who pretended to be a lion and fooled the forest until the wind blew his fur backward. There had been a pause, then laughter. Real laughter. And the next morning, a summons from the palace. The transition into court life was neither smooth nor swift. He learned the layers of etiquette, the hidden barbs in compliments, the way eyes spoke louder than words. He polished his timing, refined his metaphors, softened his truths. There were mistakes, too bold here, too meek there. But he endured, adapted, transformed. Slowly, the jester emerged from the man, like colour blooming on parchment. He sometimes wondered what his parents would think if they saw him now. Would they recognise him beneath the motley and powder? Would they understand the life he had chosen? He hoped they might smile, if only at the echoes of the boy they once knew. He carried them with him still, not in portraits or keepsakes, but in gestures, in instincts, in the steady way he tied his shoes each morning, and the hush he kept before. A performance. There were days he missed the simplicity of his village, the way people spoke plainly, the rhythm of seasons marked by harvest and frost. At court, seasons passed in whispers and shifts of power. Even joy felt strategic. Still, he found ways to ground himself. A carved wooden bird in his chamber, shaped like the ones that nested near his childhood roof. A lullaby hummed under his breath before stepping on stage. These quiet rituals tethered him to the boy he once was, even as the man became a stranger. And yet, the jester could not return. Not truly. Time had redrawn him. Even if he walked the old path again, the village would see a mask, not a son. He had grown into something too loud for their quiet lives, too strange in his truth wrapped in jest. Perhaps that was the final cost of transformation. Not losing where you came from, but becoming someone who could no longer belong to it. He consoled himself with purpose. If he could not return, he could still honor that beginning. Every time he made someone think behind a smile, every time he softened a cruel decree with a carefully aimed quip, he paid tribute to the lessons born in fields and firelight. His wit had been forged in the simple, honest air of a life that knew sorrow but chose laughter. That, he believed, made his words matter more than gold. Sometimes, when the court grew too heavy, he found himself sketching the outline of his village in the condensation on a goblet or the corner of a parchment. The hills, the bend in the river, the roof that always leaked. It lived inside him, untouched by time. It gave him strength when his own courage faltered, reminded him that before the titles and toasts, there had been a child who laughed under rain clouds and believed stories could change the world. Now, that belief was all he had left of home, and so he clung to it. When he told tales of kings and fools, he wasn't just entertaining, he was preserving something older, purer. A way of seeing the world that said humor could be kind, and truth could wear a smile. He wasn't just performing for nobles. He was whispering across time to the fire-lit faces of a place that had given him his first stage and his first audience. One night, after a long winter banquet, he returned to his chamber and sat beside the window, watching snow fall like whispers from the stars. He closed his eyes and, without realizing, began to hum his mother's nameless tune. It rose like a ghost, soft and warm. In that moment, the palace walls faded. The candle became a hearth, and he was home, not in place, but in spirit. For as long as he remembered, the village would never be lost. He opened his eyes, smiled gently, and whispered, "Thank you." Then, wrapping the motley closer around him, he laid back, and for the first time in many nights, slept deeply, dreaming not of courts or crowns, but of crooked fences and songs with no name. Before the fire dimmed, He rose once more and took, from his trunk, a worn piece of cloth, a scrap from his childhood tunic, faded with time but still bearing the stitching of his mother's hand. He held it gently, the way one might hold a leaf in autumn or a memory that cannot be remade. It wasn't sentimentality, it was ritual. It reminded him that the jester was not born in courtly laughter, but in quiet courage, in the hearts of two people who had given everything so their son might walk freely into the uncertain. As dawn bled into the dark sky, he folded the cloth with care and returned it to its place. There would be another performance soon, another day of jests and glances, another night of tired smiles. But before all of that, there had been this sacred pause, where he was simply a man remembering the place that had made him. And in that remembrance, he found enough strength to carry the motley once more. The court, for all its glittering gowns and polished marble, was never truly still. Beneath the surface, elegance ran currents of ambition, fear, and quiet desperation. The jester had learned to read these currents with the ease of a sailor reading winds. Every tilt of a goblet, every whisper behind a fan, every too quick glance told him more than the loudest declarations. To survive here, one needed more than wit. One needed instinct. And over the years, his had sharpened into something close to prophecy. He began to notice patterns others missed. The subtle withdrawal of a noble from his usual seat. The way servants hurried a little faster past certain doors. The laughter that rang a note too high after a toast. These signs spoke of tremors beneath the stone, a new alliance, a fading favor, a plot clothed in politeness. The jester had no title, no estate, no guards. Yet he knew more than most, for everyone thought he was harmless. And those considered harmless are often allowed to linger in rooms others are barred from. He was, in many ways, the court's shadow archivist. Not of deeds or wars, but of mood, tension, truth. He remembered the days when a jest about rising bread prices led to a sudden tightening of grain distribution, or the evening he mimicked a certain duke's habit of stroking his beard when lying, only to see the man shave it off the next morning. These were victories, though quiet ones, proof that even the faintest laugh could ripple through power like a stone dropped in still water. And yet, such awareness came with a toll. It was exhausting, this constant watching, calculating, anticipating. There were times he envied the simplicity of the courtiers who believed only what they were told, who drank and danced without suspicion. But the jester could never unsee. His mind moved too fast, connecting threads others ignored. He became a man of echoes, hearing double meanings in every praise, feeling danger in every pause. Despite the exhaustion, he could not turn away. To him, the court was not a stage. It was a living script, rewritten each day in silences and glances. He studied it like a scholar might study scripture, not for praise, but for truth. And the truths he uncovered were rarely beautiful. He saw greed disguised as charity, envy hidden beneath praise, cruelty wrapped in law. He laughed at it, of course. That was his role. But inside, he mourned what it cost to keep the court spinning. There were nights he wished he could unlearn it all, to return to innocence, to believe again that kings were noble and decrees just. But such wishes were foolish, and he knew too well the price of foolishness when it's real. So instead, he refined his craft, turning truth into riddles, warnings into wit. His jokes danced on the edge of a fence, sharp enough to draw blood, but wrapped in such colour that even those mocked smiled. He had come to understand that power does not fear silence, it fears laughter. A ruler can command silence, but laughter, that is unruly, unpredictable. Laughter spreads, it emboldens. And so the jester's blade was not forged of steel, but of syllables. And each performance became an act of subtle rebellion, a mirror held up to the faces too used to flattery. One winter, during a feast meant to celebrate a recent military conquest, he stood before the court and told the story of a hunter who caged a lion and paraded it as proof of his power. The lion, silent and bound, became a symbol of fear, but Each night, the hunter slept more fitfully, hearing growls in dreams, until he no longer dared close his eyes. When he finished, the hall had gone very still. The general laughed the loudest, too loud. The king did not laugh at all. That night, no one approached him with compliments. No coins were slipped into his palm. Instead, there was a hush wherever he walked, as if his presence reminded people of something they'd rather forget. He was used to that by now. Truth, even when told in jest, left behind a shadow. But he was not always so alone. There had been those who saw through the motley to the man beneath, a chamberlain who once wept quietly during a tale of a forgotten son, a noblewoman who whispered thanks after he performed a skit about unspoken grief. These rare moments kept him going, proof that beneath the masks of courtly roles, there were still hearts that beat with feeling, still minds that longed for honesty, if only in disguise. And so he walked this razor's edge, part clown, part conscience. He made people laugh not to entertain but to awaken. He delivered foolishness as medicine. It was dangerous work, even if few called it so. The court saw jesters as ornaments, not instruments. But he knew the truth. He was a needle sewing seams no one else could touch. A voice that could say what others could not, and survive, barely. The longer he lived at court, the more he saw how tightly fear bound everyone. Servants feared reprimand, lords feared irrelevance, advisors feared disfavor. Even the king, for all his power, feared being unloved. The jester feared too, but not for himself. He feared for what might be lost if everyone stopped listening, if humor became hollow, if truth disappeared beneath velvet and wine. One morning, as he wandered the garden alone, he passed a young scribe who had just arrived at court. The boy bowed nervously, clutching his scrolls like shields. The jester paused, smiled, and asked, "What truth have you written today?" The boy blinked, unsure how to respond. I only copy what I'm told." The jester nodded gently. "Then make sure one day you copy something worth remembering." That exchange stayed with him. He realized then that not all lessons must be shouted. Some are whispered, passed from glance to glance, generation to generation. He had once been that boy. Now he was the one leaving echoes behind. That evening, he performed a short piece about a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your intentions. The audience laughed, nervously. Some looked away. Others studied the jester more closely than before. He didn't explain the meaning. He never did. The point was not to tell them what to think, but to make them think at all. In the quiet hours, after the feast, he walked the empty halls, feeling the palace breathe. It was not a place of rest, this court. It was a place of unspoken wars. And he, dressed in bells and motley, was its most unlikely soldier. He had no armor but words, no allies but timing. And yet, in the theater of power, he stood tall, not because he was feared, but because he had learned how to be necessary. Before, sleeping, he lit a single candle and watched it flicker. "Let them laugh," he whispered. "Let them wonder." Then he smiled, closed his eyes, and let the silence cradle him. Later that night, he sat at his small desk and began to write, not jokes, not performances, but reflections. He chronicled what he saw, what he feared, what he hoped might someday change, not for fame, and certainly not for legacy. He wrote for himself, to preserve clarity in a world that blurred intentions with smiles. He filled pages with truths hidden beneath banquets, with kindnesses no one noticed, and cruelties everyone pretended not to see. He remembered a page boy who once secretly replaced the wilted flowers in the queen's vase each morning, just to make her smile. He wrote about that. He remembered a knight who knelt beside a servant's broken cart during a storm and helped carry the wheels in silence. He wrote about that too. These moments mattered. They were not history as the chroniclers told it, but history as it truly lived, quiet, human, hidden. By the time the candle had burned halfway down, the jester set down his quill and looked at the stack of papers beside him. It was not a grand record. It was a lantern, small, flickering but steady, and perhaps, someday, someone would find it and understand that even in a palace of power and pride, there had been one man who chose to see clearly. And with that thought, he rose, stretched, and allowed the weariness to claim him. As he drifted into sleep, he dreamed not of performances or court intrigue, but of ink, parchment, and the quiet power of remembering. The court awoke not with songbirds, but with the murmurs of servants and the rustle of silk robes gliding across stone. Even the sunrise here seemed choreographed, filtering through stained glass windows in just the right hue to flatter those at breakfast. It was a world built not for truth, but for illusion. And the jester, for all his clarity, was still a part of its design. He often began his mornings early, before the halls filled with echoing voices and perfumed airs. These were his quiet hours, when he could walk unnoticed, observe unguarded expressions, and listen to the way the palace breathed. His boots made no sound on the velvet-carpeted floors. His bells remained silent. He moved like a ghost in his own home. This morning was different, though. There was a stillness that didn't belong, a kind of held breath. He noticed it first in the way the kitchen fires burned lower, the way the guards looked not outward but toward the great hall. Something had shifted. He followed the current as he always did, winding through side corridors until he reached the gallery above the main audience chamber. Below, the court was gathering, earlier than usual. No music, no jest. The king sat on his throne, face carved, from stone, surrounded by advisors wearing expressions like polished masks. A messenger stood before them, dusty and pale. He held a scroll, tightly, as if it might escape. And then he read. The words tumbled like stones. A province had risen, a rebellion, quiet, precise, and too well organized. Not peasant rage, but noble discontent. The jester leaned forward, heart calm. He had known something was coming. Now it had a name. He remembered whispers weeks earlier, minor lords shortening visits, letters sealed too tightly, eyes scanning exits during feasts, signs no one else had noticed or dared to voice. But a jester could observe without suspicion. He carried no sword, only words. And sometimes words were sharper. That evening, the mood in the palace changed. The musicians played faster, as if tempo could mask tension. The nobles laughed louder, their mirth hollow and rehearsed. The king dined without touching his food. The jester performed, as he always did. But tonight his stories carried barbs. He told of a kingdom ruled by a man so obsessed with mirrors that he forgot to see the people behind him. A few chuckles rose, but more glances darted toward the throne. The king did not smile. After the show, the jester slipped away, not to his chamber, but to the library. He lit a small lamp and pulled volumes not for pleasure, but for preparation. He knew the patterns of power. Rebellions were never only about land or taxes. They were about voices, who could speak and who could be heard. He began writing again, not performance notes, but observations. Who sat where, who whispered when, who drank deeply, and who feigned thirst. He was not recording history. He was drawing maps of influence, tracing fault lines beneath the marbled floors. In the days that followed, the court became a theatre of caution. Smiles grew thinner, compliments longer. People chose their allies as one might choose wine, carefully, by scent, alone. The jester remained in demand, his performances a welcome distraction. But behind every jest was a question, and behind every laugh, an unease. The jester began to feel the walls closing, not with bricks, but with silence. People who once greeted him now offered only nods. Servants whispered when he passed. His jokes were still met with laughter, but it was laughter stretched too tight, like a string about to snap. He had always walked a fine line, but now that line trembled beneath him. One evening, he was summoned not to the banquet hall, but to the king's private chamber. The summons came without fanfare. A sealed note slipped beneath his door. When he entered, he found the king alone, staring into the hearth. The flames flickered against his face, casting shadows that made his crown seem heavier. "You see things others do not," the king said without turning. "You hear what is unspoken." The jester said nothing. Silence was safer than agreement. "Tell me, fool," the king continued, "why do men turn against their sovereign?" The jester paused. He could lie, offer a flattering tale of traitors and ambition, but the king already knew those answers. What he wanted, perhaps feared, was the truth. "Because," the jester said softly, "some kings forget that crowns are lent, not inherited, that loyalty is earned, not demanded, and that even the quietest hunger can become a roar." The king turned then, his eyes unreadable. He said nothing for a long while. Finally, he waved a hand. "You may go." The jester bowed and left, heart steady, thoughts racing. He had spoken truth to power, wrapped in silk, but truth nonetheless. He didn't know if it would save him or doom him. The next morning, the palace hummed with new energy. The rebellion had not reached the gates, but it had reached the conversations. Plans were made behind curtains. Strategies whispered in corners. The jester, as always, listened. He began altering his performances subtly. Stories of distant lands where rulers listened, where jesters were more than ornaments. He spoke of empires that fell not from outside force, but from within, rotted by pride, deaf to warnings. The audience laughed, unsure if they should, and yet they returned each night, unable to look away. One night, he ended a tale with a single line. "When the candle forgets it burns, the dark remembers." He bowed and left the hall without a word. That phrase echoed for days. He became a quiet force within the palace. Servants passed him folded notes. A young guard slipped him a list of names, lords who met in secret. He did not report them. He recorded them. He did not trust any side completely. His loyalty was not to crown or cloak, but to truth. In the quiet of his chamber, he mapped out the palace not by architecture, but by fear, where it clustered, where it festered, and where, just maybe, it could be healed. He was no general, but he understood morale. He was no priest, but he knew confession. He was no rebel, but he longed for change. And sometimes he dreamed of leaving, of vanishing into a caravan, or a village, or the mist. But every time he pictured escape, he remembered the faces, those still listening, those who laughed with hope, not mockery, and he stayed. On the eve of the Festival of Lights, when lanterns were strung from turret to terrace and the entire court shimmered in gold, the jester prepared a new piece. Not comedic, not pointed, just quiet. A tale of an old tree in a storm. The tree, weathered and bare, had lost many branches. Yet it stood, not because it was strong, but because its roots were deep, and in its shade new saplings waited. As he spoke, the court fell silent. The king leaned forward. The lords did not drink. The servants, for once, did not move. When he finished, there was no applause, only a stillness that felt like listening. That night, he returned to his chamber with a sense of finality. Not an end, but a shift. He lit his candle and wrote one line in his journal. Even in darkness, the fool can be a lantern. And so he remained, no longer merely the jester, but something else. A witness, a whisper, a seed planted in uncertain soil. Whatever came next, he would meet it not with armor, but with clarity, not with allegiance, but with awareness, and not with fear, but with that most dangerous of weapons, truth told beautifully. And outside the palace, beyond its walls and whispers, the world turned still. Villagers lit their own lanterns. Far-off fires flickered under stars that never bent to kings or crowns. Somewhere, a child laughed without knowing of courts or rebellions, and somewhere else, an old woman remembered a jester who once made her weep with a story of hope. These echoes travelled, soft and slow, and the jester, though confined to marble halls, was never truly alone, for his words, like seeds, had found soil beyond stone. The lanterns from the Festival of Lights still flickered the next morning, swaying gently in the cold breeze that crept through the corridors. The jester awoke not to the clamour of servants or the rustle of tapestries, but to an unusual quiet, like the hush before a storm. The palace was listening, he realized, not to music or decree, but to itself. He rose slowly, stretching joints that had stiffened from too many hours hunched in thought. The candle on his desk had melted down to a stub. Wax pooled like a frozen sigh. His journal lay open, words inked in the small, careful hand of a man who knew the weight of each sentence. He skimmed what he'd written the night before. No edits, no regrets. He stepped into the corridor and was met with lowered voices, sidelong glances, and a stillness that ran deeper than silence. Something had happened, or was about to. The air felt charged, like a stage just before the curtain rose. His feet took him, almost without thinking, to the Queen's garden, where few ever wandered this early. There, under a bare-limbed willow, he found her. The Queen, alone, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the morning frost. She did not startle. When he approached, she merely looked up, eyes tired but clear. "You always walk where others won't," she said. The jester offered a quiet bow. "Perhaps I've grown fond of paths no one else takes." The Queen smiled faintly, brushing her fingers across a wilted bloom. "They forget I once walked. The same roads. Before I wore jewels, I wore dust." The jester tilted his head. "And do they see you now? Or only the crown?" She did not answer, but her silence was its own reply. For a while, they sat beneath the willow. No guards, no titles, just two people watching breath turn to mist. The jester felt the weight of unspoken truths between them, the shared understanding of those who play their parts, but never forget, the script is written in ink that can smudge. Eventually, she rose. "Be careful, fool. They smile with daggers now." He nodded, watching her disappear into the maze of hedges. He knew she was right. The court was shifting, and in shifts, people fall. Later that day, a decree spread like spilled wine, swift and staining. A lord had been stripped of title. "Treason," they whispered. No trial, no chance to speak. The king's voice, once measured, now echoed with finality. The jester watched reactions closely. Some flinched. Others straightened, as if reassured. But everyone noticed. That evening, his performance was met with apprehension. He avoided satire. Instead, he told the story of a falcon caged by its own golden bars. The bird could sing, but never soar. The metaphor wasn't lost. The applause was brief. That night, he walked the inner courtyard alone, trailing his fingers along the cold stone walls. In the shadows near the fountain, he heard hushed voices. Two advisors. Words floated. To him, loyalty, containment, message. He moved past them without pause, but each word etched itself into his mind like a chisel to marble. Back in his chamber, he revised his maps. Not of geography, but of alignment. Who bent toward the throne, who leaned away. He was no spy, but the palace itself confessed to him in footsteps and stares. Days passed. One evening he was summoned again, not to the king, but to the high priest. A rare encounter. The chapel was dim, lit only by altar candles. The jester bowed, but the priest waved it away. "You see much," the old man said, "and you speak wisely." "I try to speak clearly," the jester replied. "Wisdom and clarity are often the same," said the priest, "but they are not always welcome." They stood in silence, listening to wax drip. The priest turned to him. "Should the storm come, and it will, Remember that not all truth must be told at once. It was a warning and a blessing. The jester left the chapel more thoughtful than before. He had always believed in truth as a lantern, but now he wondered, could too much light blind? Soon after, the rebellion reached the city gates, not with fire and steel, but with parchment, a letter signed by nobles demanding reform. No swords drawn, yet, but the threat of civil war hung in the air like smoke before a blaze. The court recoiled, the king raged, and the jester watched. Each faction tried to claim him. One lord offered gold for a jest aimed at his rivals. Another promised protection in exchange for silence. He refused both, choosing instead the perilous path of neutrality. But neutrality in a storm often leaves one soaked by both sides. That evening, he performed a tale of a ship lost in fog, where the compass spun wild and the stars refused to shine. The crew, he said, quarreled over who should steer, and so none did. The audience murmured. Some looked down. The king left early. Later, in his chamber, he found a note slipped beneath the door. No name, just a line. Some lanterns draw arrows. He burned it, but the meaning remained. He began hiding his writings behind loose bricks beneath floorboards, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some truths are seeds. They must be buried before they can bloom. And yet, amidst the tension, he found moments of strange calm. A child chasing butterflies in the orchard. A cook humming an old lullaby. Life persisting. But even calm has its cost. One morning, a servant girl, bright-eyed, kind, was gone. Disappeared. Some said she fled. Others whispered she asked the wrong question. The jester remembered her laughter. He added her name to his secret ledger, a silent roll of those who vanished not in battle, but in fear. Then came the procession. A show of unity, they called it. The king paraded through the streets, flanked by knights in gleaming armor. The ram people lined the roads, unsure whether to cheer or stay silent. The jester rode behind, mask in place, heart heavy. He saw the fear in their eyes, the doubt, the hunger for something more than ceremony. That night, alone again, he wrote, "Power parades when it forgets how to speak." He was weary, not of jesting, but of pretending it mattered. Yet, in his heart, he knew it did. Words could heal or haunt. He could not stop the tides, but he might show someone the moon that stirred them. And so, when the time came to speak again, he did not mock. He did not veil his meaning. He stood before the court and said, "Sometimes the truest fool is the one who dares to whisper what others fear to think." And then he bowed. Not as a performer, but as a man. The court did not applaud. They sat in silence, the kind that stretches between breaths. And then, slowly, the queen placed her hand over her heart. Others followed. No sound, just gesture, respect, perhaps, or reckoning. He left the hall not exalted, but lighter. Outside, snow had begun to fall, gentle and slow. Each flake a reminder that even the coldest seasons pass. Later, by firelight, he penned his thoughts not for history, but for those who might one day ask, how did the fool survive the storm? His answer, by listening, by speaking gently, by seeing what others could not, and by refusing to be silent, even when his voice trembled. That night, sleep came easily, not with dreams of escape, but with the quiet certainty that he had become more than his bells and stories. He was a witness, and witnesses endure. Somewhere in the city below, a candle was lit in a cottage window. A mother sang softly to her child, her voice floating upward like a prayer. The jester never heard it, but he might have felt it. In the way the wind gentled near his tower, or how the fire refused to die. Stories, he thought, are not kept in books. They are carried in breaths, in glances, in the spaces between silence. And so long as someone remembers, The fool has not truly fallen. The first rays of dawn filtered through the high windows, casting pale light upon empty banquet tables and overturned chairs. The jester rose when most still slumbered, his mind heavy but determined. Last night's words had rippled through the court like pebbles in water, and he sensed the echoes would not fade quickly. He wrapped the motley around his shoulders, fastening the bells with a soft jingle that seemed too loud in the stillness. Today he would move carefully, the way one treads on cracked ice. He made his way to the royal garden, a place where courtiers often walked to collect their thoughts. The winter chill lingered, but the promise of spring lay in the small green shoots pushing through the soil. He paused by a stone bench and waited. It wasn't long before he saw her approaching, one of the young pages, hat in hand, eyes nervous. She stopped a respectful distance away. "You wish to see me, Master Jester?" she asked, voice trembling. He nodded and patted the bench. "Sit," he invited. "But first, tell me, what do you see when you look at these flowers?" The page blinked, turning toward the path of crocuses and snowdrops. "Beauty," she began hesitantly, "and hope." The jester smiled faintly. "Yes, but also fragility. These blooms survive the frost, but only if they find warmth. Do not forget that." She nodded slowly, absorbing his metaphor more than his words. He continued, "The court is like these flowers, delicate, beautiful, but easily crushed if the cold grows too strong." Her gaze dropped to her hands, clenched around a small parchment. I found this note in the hall," she said, offering it. "It's addressed to you." The jester took the parchment carefully. The handwriting was familiar, wiry, urgent. He unfolded it and read, "Meet at the northern gate at twilight. Truth waits where light fades." No signature. He folded the note and slid it into his sleeve. "Thank you," he said. "Remember, strength is not always loud." The page offered a small bow and slipped away. The jester watched her go, feeling the weight of his own words as they settled like frost on the ground. He returned to the hall at mid-morning. "There," servants whispered in hushed tones, and guards eyed him with curiosity. He moved through the corridors as though walking a tightrope stretched between yesterday and tomorrow. Every glance felt loaded. He had become not just a performer, but a figure of silent authority, someone who said nothing and yet was heard by all. At the royal council chamber, he paused outside the doors. Clear light spilled through the carved panels, illuminating the map table where ministers arranged their strategies. He remembered a time when he would have passed without notice. Now, heads turned. Some faces hardened, others softened. He dipped his head and continued on, avoiding invitations. Today was not for jest, but for observation. By midday, the jester found himself drawn to the training yard. Knights practiced their drills, swords clanging, horses snorting. He stood at the periphery, watching. Each stroke of metal against metal rang a promise of conflict if words failed. The air smelled of sweat and steel, a stark contrast to the perfumed halls above. He glanced at their determined faces, the way they fought for honor, for duty, or for something deeper. None of them knew how close they were to war, but he did. He had felt it in the tremor of voices below the chamber floors. One of the squires, young and earnest, noticed him. "Master Jester," the boy called, stumbling. "Over protocol. Sir Roland requests your presence." The jester inclined his head. Roland was a knight who admired his subtlety. They walked together toward the knight's pavilion. Inside, Roland stood beside a wooden cutout of a foe, sword poised for practice. When the jester entered, he lowered the sword and offered a nod. "Just last night," Roland began, voice low but respectful. "It carried truth. The men speak of it even now. They ask, what does the tree's story mean for us?" The jester studied Roland's face. "It means that even the mightiest can fall if their roots weaken. You do well to remember not only how to fight, but why." Roland sheathed his sword. "I understand, but my orders come from above. They say the rebellion must be crushed. The jester sighed. If you crush the wrong revolt, you stifle more than dissent. You extinguish hope. Roland nodded slowly, as though weighing each word. Is there another way? He asked. The jester shook his head. I wish there were. But sometimes truth is the last defense against darkness, and we must choose carefully which fires to light. Roland placed a firm hand on the jester's shoulder. Thank you, friend. I will remember. They parted, and the jester walked back to the courtyard, feeling the burden of each man armed with his words. As dusk approached, he found himself at the northern gate, where the walls rose like silent sentinels. The air grew colder, and shadows lengthened. His breath formed a soft mist as he waited. The note's promise of truth was both invitation and warning. He wondered who would come, and if they came bearing friend or foe. Minutes felt like hours. Then a figure emerged from the twilight. A woman draped in a dark cloak, hood pulled low. Her footsteps were light, but he recognized the sway of her gait. He stepped forward, the bells at his collar jingling once. She halted. I trust you came alone, he said. She nodded. No one else can hear us here. She pulled back the hood to reveal the face of the Queen's advisor, Lady Celeste. Her eyes sharp, her lips pressed in a thin line. The Queen sent me. He studied her. Then what does she want? She wants to protect you as much as herself, Celeste replied. The rebellion, it spreads. Not just provinces, but hearts. Many lords have pledged to the cause. They want a new order, one where the crown answers to the people, not the other way around. The jester felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. A fair idea, he murmured. But who is the cause? Who commands this army of whispers? Celeste's eyes flashed. No one single. It is a chorus of voices, nobles, merchants, scholars, each with their own chains. They unite under a common banner, a council to advise the king rather than obey him. The jester nodded slowly. A council of many, ruling through council, dangerous to both crown and people if misused. Celeste sighed. The Queen fears blood. She fears that when the first sword is drawn, there is no turning back. She asked me to find you. You see what others do not. He glanced toward the gates, where darkness pressed against the walls like a living thing. And what does the Queen want me to do? Celeste hesitated. We need a message, a bridge, someone to speak for both sides, truth wrapped in laughter, so it can cross between ears that refuse to hear. We thought of you. The jester felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. A messenger, then. A fool's duty. Celeste nodded. But time is short. The lords intend to send their demands tomorrow, and if the king refuses, they will march. He closed his eyes, recalling the snowflake and the candle in the cottage. Very well, he said at last. I will speak, but my words will not be for the king or the nobles alone. They will be for every soul that still believes. Celeste's relief was palpable. She brushed snow from her cloak. Be careful, she whispered. They trust you, but not all will forgive the fool's truth. He inclined his head. I know, but I must try. She slipped away, melting into the night. He remained a moment longer, the wind twisting his motley, and then turned toward the palace. Ahead lay more than stages. There lay destiny. In the days that followed, the jester prepared his lines not for jest, but for judgment. He rehearsed beside the hearth, voice steady, heart anchoring each syllable in conviction. When the moment came to stand before crown and council, he would carry not just words, but the hopes of a kingdom that whispered of change in every corner. The morning after the Queen's summons, the jester stood in the courtyard lantern lit and watched the court stir. Today would be the day he spoke before crown and council. He had prepared his words with care, folding truth into layers of metaphor so they might reach ears hardened by power. Still, as he adjusted the colourful patches of his motley, he felt the familiar tremor, a mixture of purpose and fear. He moved through the corridors, greeted only by cautious glances. Even the servants paused as he passed, then hurried on, unwilling to linger. He reached the entrance to the great hall, where a single trumpeter sounded a note that echoed like a heartbeat. He stepped inside. The hall swelled with murmurs. Lords in fur-trimmed cloaks, advisors in silken gowns, priests in embroidered robes. The king sat upon his carved throne, mask of calm. The queen perched to his side, eyes shadowed by worry. The high priest and Lady Celeste stood near the dais, their gazes steady. A silence fell as the jester approached. He knelt once, and the bells at his collar sang a single note that rang across the hall. Then he rose and bowed to the king. The court waited. He began. Your Majesties, honoured lords, keepers of crown and council, there is a fire that burns not in hearths, but in hearts. Today I speak not as a joker, but as a witness to its flame. A ripple of unease passed through the audience. The king leaned forward. The jester continued. Imagine a bridge built of ivory and stone, spanning a chasm so wide that neither side may see the other. The bridge stands tall, never tested by wind or weather. One day, a traveller ventures forth. At first, the arches seem sturdy, the path secure. But halfway across, the traveller hears a crack, tiny, faint. A stone shifts, yet he continues, trusting the bridge's grandeur. Below him, the chasm widens, and soon the bridge wavers. Only then do they realize that what stood proudly can falter when neglected. He paused, letting the image settle. The court stands upon such a bridge, built on honor, loyalty, tradition. But its stones are loosening. First, a lord's whisper, then a queen's silence, then a king's doubt. We build grand halls and feast on plundered grain, yet we forget that the smallest crack can bring a collapse. The king's gaze hardened. You speak boldly, fool. Are you saying our foundation is unsound? The jester nodded. I am saying that foundations must be tended. No one stands above repair. Humility is the mortal cement that binds our stones. When pride replaces purpose, the weakest joint can break the strongest arch. A murmur rose. Some courtiers nodded. Others sneered. The jester met each reaction with calm eyes. He moved closer to the dais, voice softening. Rebellion is not born of ambition alone, but of ears that stop hearing. The lords who sign petitions, who gather secretly, they do so because they believe. Their voices vanish into empty halls. The people beyond the walls hunger not just for bread, but for fairness. If we do not listen, the fire in their hearts will burn hotter. Lady Celeste stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Speak your truth, fool. Speak it fully. He inclined his head. I urge the king to seek counsel, not only from nobles, but from every soul who calls this realm home. Let the council include voices of merchants, farmers, and scribes, those who breathe the same air but feel no share of power. Let the Queen's compassion shape our laws, not fear. And let each lord remember that loyalty given can also be withdrawn, and that a ruler's strength lies not in armies, but in the trust of his people. Silence reigned. The king's face was inscrutable. Finally, he spoke. You ask much of us, Jester, to tear down walls and build new ones. Do you promise this will? Quell the rebellion? The jester met his gaze. I cannot promise calm waters, but I can promise that if we rebuild together, the river below will not need to force its course through our gates. The queen rose, clasping her hands. I too see the danger. Let us heed this warning. Several lords exchanged heated whispers, but the weight of truth had been cast. The high priest cleared his throat. A council of diverse voices may be unheard of, but our scriptures speak of communion and unity. I will stand for this. The king leaned back, his gaze sweeping the hall. Finally he nodded. So be it. A council shall convene under the watch of this fool. Let us test the strength of our bridge. The hall exhaled. Some proclaimed victory. Others scowled. The jester bowed deeply. His words had shaped destiny. After the council adjourned, he slipped into the corridors like a whisper. He found Lady Celeste in the Queen's private chambers. She smiled, relief in her eyes. "You have done well," she said. He shook his head. "Only the first step. Now the work begins." That night, he returned to his chamber and wrote in his journal, "Truth is not a weapon to be wielded, but a seed to be sown." He closed the book and lay back, bells silent, heart racing. Tomorrow he would watch the seeds grow, or be trampled beneath ambition once more. Yet for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The bridge had not collapsed, at least not today. In the days that followed, the halls buzzed with preparations. Ministers drafted charters, scribes copied decrees, lords assembled lists of grievances. The jester watched from corners, noting who spoke first, who lingered behind, who tried to sway the council's direction. Each gathering felt like tuning, a grand instrument. One false note, and the melody would shatter. He visited the training yard again. Roland approached him, expression taut with responsibility. "They named me to the council," Roland said, voice quiet. "But some of the old guard oppose me." The jester nodded. "Stand firm. Remember the falcon in gold. Gold that cages only glitters for so long." Roland squared his shoulders. "I will," he promised. In the marketplace, he mingled among merchants peddling winter's last harvest. He spoke in riddles to a stand selling dried herbs, hinting at the need for unity. To a baker, he whispered of bread not just as food, but as a bond. Crowds gathered to hear him, laughing at first, then listening, then nodding. Word spread. The fool speaks of more than laughter. He speaks of survival. One evening, he found himself standing under the palace balcony as the Queen practiced her evening prayers. He listened as she spoke for her people, to guide, to protect, to heal. When she finished, she descended and approached him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving voice to my hopes." He touched the brim of his hat. "Only because you listened." Back in his chamber, the jester penned a final note. "A kingdom's true strength lies not in crowns and swords, but in the song of its people, heard and honored." He closed his journal, knowing that tomorrow the council would convene, and the kingdom's future would pivot upon words spoken and promises kept. The next morning, as the council gathered in the grand chamber once more, the jester stood near the back, bells silent, eyes bright. He watched as representatives from every walk of life, noble and merchant, soldier and scholar, farmer and priest, took their seats. For the first time, the court felt like a true crossroads of voices. When the king called the council to order, the jester's heart swelled. He had walked a perilous path, spoken truths in colourful riddles, and faced the risk of silence or worse. But now, he saw something that mattered more than his own survival. The foundations of his homeland shifting, not with the weight of steel, but with the power of words. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the child's laughter in the jig and the mother's lullaby in the cottage. In that moment, he understood that no decree, no sword, could match the force of a kingdom's collective voice. And as he opened his eyes, he knew that the jester's greatest jest had been to remind them all of that truth. The council chamber was unrecognizable from days before. Banners bearing lords' sigils had been replaced by simple pennons celebrating unity. Where once richness pressed upon every surface, now the air felt freer, lighter. The jester entered, motley stitched with new purpose. He observed as every delegate took their seat. farmers nodding alongside merchants, a scholar whispering to a knight, a widow in plain garb seated at the edge. The palace had become something else, a confluence of voices rather than a theatre of suspicion. He felt a spark of wonder, yet knew his task was far from over. A hush fell as the king rose. His bearing seemed less carved, more human. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried weight not of power, but of responsibility. My council, assembled by will and necessity, speak now not in echoes of past command, but in the clarity of our shared future. We have gathered to shape a realm where no voice is silenced, no heart left in the shadows. The jester watched from the rear. This was the day his words planted seeds. Now, those seeds took root. He felt a tremor of hope course through him. The queen, standing to his right, added, "We remember the cracks that threatened our bridge. We now lay new stones, not alone, but together. Each heart here bears both crown and counsel. So speak, freely, that we might find harmony in our many voices." A murmur of assent swept the chamber. The jester drew in a breath, knowing the council's work would stretch beyond this day. But in the clarity of those first words lay promise. Now, each delegate stood to present. The first was a merchant, sunlight catching the coins on his satchel. He pleaded for fair trade regulations that would ease burdens on all towns, not just the capital. The next, a farmer, spoke of fields laid waste by drought and called for relief. A scholar spoke of education, that knowledge should be shared under open skies. Each voice carried a truth that rang in the king's ears, not as complaint, but as guidance. When it was Roland's turn, he spoke not only of war readiness, but of peacekeeping armies trained to heal as well as protect. He recalled the jester's fable, the falcon in golden bars. "We must not forge soldiers for pride alone, but for service," he said. The hall nodded in agreement. The jester reflected on how far they had come. He remembered the frostbitten dawn at the northern gate, the hush of the queen's garden, the quiet warning from the high priest. Each moment had led to this. Every word, every risk, a stone in the bridge they now traversed. But the council was not just ceremony. They addressed cold fields, hoarded grain, beggars at the gates. Compassion, once an afterthought, now guided their discourse. Where closed doors once defined policy, now windows opened to new ideas. Debates flared, but with respect. When tempers rose, Celeste gently reminded, "Remember why we gather," and tempers cooled, not out of fear, but mutual purpose. The sun dipped low and shadows grew. At last, the king called the council to a close. "We shall reconvene at dawn," he said, "for today's work is only the beginning." The jester bowed, bells whispering once. He left the chamber with Celeste by his side. In the corridor, she spoke quietly. "You have done what many thought impossible. You brought hearts to this table." He shook his head. "I was only the conductor. They provided the melody." She smiled. "A conductor matters." They parted ways. The jester returned to his chamber and removed his motley jacket, laying it gently on the chest. For the first time, the patches seemed less costume and more tapestry, woven of many threads, many colors, each vital to the whole. He sat before his desk, lit a fresh candle, and opened his journal. He wrote, "A bridge holds when every voice lights the path. May these voices endure." He closed his eyes, letting the candle's glow remind him of those first days, cold halls, wary glances, cautious hope. How fragile it had been. Yet here, they stood, a council of many, forging something new. That night, the jester wandered the palace, now quiet, but for soft laughter drifting from the great hall. He paused as a child peered at him, the young princess, eyes shining with curiosity. "Tell me a story," she whispered. He knelt, smiling. "Once there was a kingdom where stones spoke truth," he began. And as he told a simple tale of kindness and courage. The princess laughed, then listened, then smiled with understanding. In that moment, he saw the future, the next generation carrying laughter laced with wisdom. Later, he found Roland practicing his blade under torchlight. The knight paused. Today I led a delegation to the Farmers' Guild. They trust me now. The jester nodded. They hear your words because your roots are deep. Roland bowed. And theirs are deeper than most know. Thank you. The jester left him, heart light. In the library's hush, he walked among scrolls and tomes. Scholars knelt at desks, copying minutes of the council. They paused as he passed, whispering thanks. He realized that scholarship, once confined to ivory towers, now fed decisions in the highest chambers. Knowledge had become a tool of unity, not division. He entered the chapel and knelt before a single altar candle. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for every soul who would speak when none dared. He thanked whatever gods watched over them for the chance to serve in this season of change. When he rose, the candle's flame seemed steadier, as if echoing his conviction. Days blurred into weeks. The jester moved among courtiers, soldiers, farmers and scholars. He bore messages, both joyful and grave. Some days, he carried news of grain delivered to starving provinces. Other days, he learned of border skirmishes, where petty disputes threatened wider conflicts. In each moment, he remembered his purpose, to weave truth with laughter, hope with caution, unity with freedom. On the eve of the spring equinox, the council gathered once more. The great hall had been transformed. Flowers bloomed in stone vases. Banners from every district flew side by side. The jester marveled at how a bridge once fragile had become a roadway bathed in sunlight. The king, standing tall but not proud, gestured for quiet. The council has laboured under our watch, the king proclaimed, and I am humbled by your service. We have forged decrees that bind our people not by fear, but by respect. He gestured to the jester. And to the fool who reminded us that no voice is small, I give thanks. A murmur of gratitude rose. The queen placed a crown of laurel on the jester's hat, a simple gesture, but charged with honour. The jester touched the laurel, uncertain but proud. He spoke. My crown is but a wreath of leaves, yet it bears the weight of voices that once whispered in darkness. Let us ensure that no voice again goes unheard. The crowd erupted in applause, a warm, unforced sound, filling the hall with a promise of unity. As the applause faded, the jester slipped away to the balcony. Below, lanterns floated on the courtyard lake, their lights shivering like stars. He watched until dawn painted the sky. In that moment, he understood that his work was never done. The bridge would need tending each season, each year, each generation. He returned to his chamber and packed his motley. He would not abandon his post, but he would travel with a small lantern. A reminder that even when far from gushing streams of power, truth must burn bright. Outside, the first lark of spring sang. He listened, closing his eyes. The song spoke of renewal, of journeys beyond castle walls. In the days to come, the jester visited villages, carried messages of reform and hope. He taught children simple rhymes about fairness. He listened to elders' laments and turned them into tales of caution. He wrote letters for those who could not write, ensuring their voices joined the chorus in faraway courts. Years passed and seasons turned, and the bridge the fools and kings built together remained strong. Cracks would appear, as they always would, but each time the seeds of unity sown in laughter and truth would bloom again. The jester, now a storyteller remembered across the realm, walked unheralded among the people, listening for new cracks and mending them with words. And though he no longer wore bells, his legacy echoed in every voice that dared to speak. and in every heart that learned to listen. For in the end, the greatest jest was not in laughter, but in reminding a kingdom that true strength lies in the song of its people, heard and honored.